Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
Hi there and good evening. Welcome to Eye on the Storm, your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And joining me tonight will be other meteorologists from our family of Nexstar TV stations up and down the East Coast. We're going to do this every week during the hurricane season. Wednesdays at 8 o'clock tonight, we'll visit with meteorologists in Greenville, North Carolina, Myrtle Beach, and Charleston, South Carolina. Each week, we will focus on a different part of the East Coast, bringing you different stories and different perspectives on the tropics, both present conditions, past conditions, and we'll do forecasting as well. So let's start with what's going on right now. We're almost 2 weeks into the month of June and therefore almost 2 weeks into the 2019 hurricane season on the Atlantic side. So we'll step back and take a look at the big picture. We haven't had much to talk about since Andrea before the season even started. So we look at what's going on right now. Generally this time of year, we don't really look off in the open waters of the Atlantic. We'll look a little closer to home down by the Bahamas and the Caribbean and in the Gulf of Mexico. But if you look at these clouds that are just strolling through the southeastern part of the country, those clouds coming through Florida and up the mid-Atlantic through the Carolinas, that's actually the cold front that has been bringing many of us rain over the past few days. So while nothing really impressive is showing up that could form into a tropical system, let's talk about the few places that we do typically see hurricanes and tropical storms form this time of year. There are basically 3 in the month of June. This is years and years of data that we've compiled to show us that, number one, the Gulf of Mexico is one of the more popular spots. Generally, a storm will form in the southern Gulf of Mexico and then move inland, bringing a weak system, mainly a rainmaker, to parts of Texas or Louisiana. Nearby, on the other side, in the western Caribbean, that's another spot where we typically see hurricanes and tropical storms form this time of year. And finally, as I mentioned, right around the islands of the Bahamas. That's the third and final spot in the month of June where we would typically see tropical systems form. Sometimes they'll flirt with the East Coast. Most of the time, those systems will move offshore because if you think about it, in the month of June, like we are right now, we occasionally still get cold fronts, and cold fronts are the enemy for the tropics. They usually try to push storms out. So those are the 3 areas that we watch this time of year. But as I already mentioned, we've already got one checked off the list. Here is the list of names that we will have for the 2019 Atlantic hurricane season. We've already gone through Andrea. Next up on the list, Barry, Chantal, Dorian. There you can see the entire list. I want to point out that last year we made it all the way through the O storm. That's 15 named storms. So if we do that this year, that'll take us all the way through Olga. So again, there's a look at your 2019 hurricane names. Now the Carolinas are still recovering from Hurricane Florence and Michael from last year. Some of the highest rain totals we've ever seen from a tropical system came from Hurricane Florence right here in North Carolina. Hundreds were rescued during and after the storm. More than 4,000 homes and businesses were damaged. Right in the middle of these storms was Jerry Jackson. He is the chief meteorologist at WNCT in Greenville, North Carolina. We'll welcome in Jerry tonight. You had quite a unique perspective, Jerry, during Florence, surviving it as a resident and a homeowner in eastern North Carolina, but also covering it as a meteorologist. Talk to us about what that was like.
Well, you know, Wes, when I think of one word to describe everything, draining, that's really what that experience was. You know, if you look back at hurricane history in North Carolina, so many storms that have hit our state, they're here for 18 hours, maybe a day, and then they're gone. But this thing, Florence, slowed down on final approach and just sat over us for 3 or 4 days. And obviously it was weakening and expanding as it did so that increased the rainfall potential and the rain shield, and all that water trickles downstream, so you wind up having to deal with excessive river flooding for 2 weeks after the storm has gone. So it was draining for forecasters, it was draining for first responders, for our military, for volunteers of all kinds that were helping during that storm. Let's take a little bit of an overview of Florence last year here as we take a look at our current radar mosaic. We're actually keeping a close eye on a few strong thunderstorms near our coast tonight. So full disclosure, hopefully we won't have to cut away to do any severe weather coverage. So we'll get as far as we can in this. Here is the satellite representation of Florence on its final approach into North Carolina in September of last year. And you can see how it was weakening and unwrapping on final approach. That increased the size of the rain field. And even though the storm was in the weakening phase, it still brought a significant storm surge of about 9 to 13 feet along the coast of North Carolina. Some of our viewing area, which incidentally WNCT 9 on your side is centered in eastern North Carolina, we had some of our counties in excess of 30 to 35 inches of rain. That's almost 3/4 of a year's worth of rain in just 4 days. So obviously that trickles down into your area rivers and the Trent River in Trenton, Northeast Cape Fear River in Chinquapin. Some of these river locations were cresting over 15 to 16 feet above flood stage, and that led to, of course, all the images which have now become infamous here in the state of North Carolina. A few months ago, our weather team actually put together a special half-hour documentary entitled Hurricane Florence, 1,000 Miles, which you can find in its entirety at WNCT.com. And we looked at a lot of things and factors of Florence. It also shows a lot of behind-the-scenes forecasting that our weather team considers and looks at when we're putting together the final forecast projections. That title, 1,000 Miles, we gave it that title for a very specific reason. Florence took a highly unusual path. This graphic shows the path of every Atlantic hurricane for the past 175 years that has passed by this particular spot in the Atlantic Ocean. Notice how nearly every one turns to the north and then to the northeast, never even getting close to the east coast. But Florence was an exception to that rule. In fact, if you look, you can see it took a very sharp turn while it was out in the middle of the Atlantic, and we were intrigued while over 1,000 miles at sea why this turn actually took place. And that's what we focused a lot of that documentary on. There were many factors, but one of the big influencing factors was a big dome of high pressure to the north of Florence that eventually turned it sharply off to the west, and that course correction, if you will, finally guided the storm at long last to our shores. And of course, there were many records that were set by Florence even before it got to North Carolina. It actually became the northernmost Category 4 hurricane to ever form at this particular zone in the Atlantic. Thankfully for us, it weakened a lot down to a Category 1 hurricane on its final approach into the state of North Carolina, but still was enough to provide some near-record storm surge in some cases on the order of about 9 to 13 feet for some of our counties, and also a lot of tornado activity. Our weather team covered 40 tornado warnings that were issued by the National Weather Service offices in eastern North Carolina. Now, keep in mind that not all of those warnings were actually confirmed with ground truth, but it gives you an idea of just how active a few days' time was here in the eastern part of the state. A lot of common misconceptions for those of you who might be new to hurricane country or hurricane tracking or forecasting. There are a lot of misconceptions that people have. One is the idea that a hurricane has to be strong to cause a lot of damage. Of course, Florence was a good example of why that's not always the case. A damage total from a hurricane is a function of many factors. It's a function of how fast it's moving. If it slows down on approach, you increase the rain and flooding potential. Also, it's a factor of the geography of the coastline. Our coastline in eastern North Carolina turns every which way. We have south-facing beaches, we have east-facing coastal areas, and if you think about it, if you had an east wind at 90 miles an hour, that same wind would create a completely different surge here than it would be for our south-facing beaches. So a lot of complexity goes into putting together a hurricane forecast. Of course, a lot of terminology is thrown out this time of year by the National Hurricane Center. You hear terms like extratropical. This is an area of low pressure that is still attached to cold fronts and warm fronts. That's the type of low pressure system that very often provides us rain over land. Also a subtropical system. This is a system that has lost its connection to fronts, but is still somewhat of a cold core system most of the time. A true tropical system is no longer attached to warm or cold fronts, and it's what we refer to as a true warm core system. In other words, it's a heat engine, and it's relying almost exclusively on its warm ocean water as the main driver or fuel source. So, Wes, as I'm sure you know from years of experience, there's a lot that goes into hurricane forecasting, and knowing the terminology helps a lot.
Yeah, Jerry, I remember showing a graphic similar to that first one you showed of all the plots from the last 100+ years, and I told our viewers, listen, there has never been a hurricane that's hit the East Coast that's come this course. We still got to watch it,
exactly.
but there's never been one. So So goes the history of hurricanes. But, you know, it's been 9 months since Florence hit you guys. Can you still drive around town and see damage from back then? I mean, have people made it back yet?
You know, if you think about it, our area was hit hard by Hurricane Matthew back in 2016. And even now, you can find some residents that are still trying to recover from that storm. So yes, there are still many locations still trying to recover even from Florence. Now, don't get me wrong, we've come back a lot here in this part of the state, and a lot of improvements have been made. But yes, there are still places now, in fact, even close to my home, there are places where the roads are not quite what they used to be. There are folks that are still displaced from their homes. It is a long recovery process when you talk about that volume of water being channeled into our waterways. Again, almost 3/4 of a year's supply of rain in just 4 days.
Yeah, truly amazing. Jerry Jackson in Greenville, North Carolina. That's the eastern part of the state, the chief meteorologist for WNCT. Thanks, Jerry. Again, if you're just chiming in, it's now 8:10 on Wednesday evening. This is the first episode of our weekly series, all hurricane season long, Eye of the Storm. I'm Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're going to be up and down the East Coast every Wednesday of the hurricane season, hearing different stories, different perspectives, talking about different forecasts and conditions of the tropics. Of course, you'll hear from me and you'll hear from meteorologists up and down the East Coast, but it's the middle of June and we typically don't have a lot of activity this time of year. Here's kind of a bar graph summarizing when most of our activity forms, when most hurricanes form throughout the entire hurricane season. And obviously there's a spike later in the year, but here in June, only 2% of our tropical activity has formed in June. It's not much better in July. So while the season is officially underway, a lot of people refer to the real season not beginning until sometime in August. And if you think about it, especially in and around the Carolinas, when have the worst storms in our history hit? September. You think Fran, you think Floyd. How about Michael and Florence over the past couple of years? September and even October, even though that is only a 17% chance of when the storms form. But September is by far our busiest month when it comes to the tropics. Here's kind of a different way to look at it, a different graph that does a real good job of talking about tropical activity. What you see in yellow is hurricane activity over the years. Hurricanes and tropical storms combined would be in red. And obviously there's a peak. That peak every year, this is taking the averages, happens right around September 10th. But it's not September yet. We are still way back here. And while there's occasionally some activity, as I said, the real season doesn't get going until we get into later in the summer. Now, we started our journey in the eastern part of North Carolina. Let's head to South Carolina. Myrtle Beach has seen its fair share of hurricanes over the years, and we've all been down there on vacation. So let's talk about the impact hurricanes like Florence and Matthew have had on the Grand Strand. And to do that, we will go to Myrtle Beach and their chief meteorologist at WBTW, Frank Johnson. Frank, he's with us now. Frank, good to see you tonight. You guys have had so many 1-2 punches of storm surge and flooding over the past 2 years. Take us through what that's been like.
Yeah, and you know, this is a good time of the year. You said before we really get to the meat of the hurricane season, to go back and look at what we've seen over the last couple of years, learn from seasons past, and use that information to plan out our response if we get another hurricane this year. I want to go back and look at the last couple of years. We had Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence that hit the Carolinas over the last couple of years. These were both Category 1 hurricanes. And if you're one of those people that don't bother preparing for a Category 1, it's only a 1, you only move if it's a 3 or a 4, you want to pay attention because these are both storms that while they were only a Category 1, they had tremendous impact in our area, a lot of devastation, and unfortunately, unusually high fatalities because of these first storms. Let's start in 2016 with Hurricane Matthew. It started in the Caribbean and actually took a path very similar to Hurricane Hazel back in the 1950s, where all of a sudden it curves northward. It gets very strong across the Bahamas. Luckily for us, it moved very close to Florida, which weakened it. So as it approached the Carolinas, it was only a Category 1 storm, but it did this little hook. It came south and then it turned east across our area, and that little pivot across South Carolina and southeastern parts of North Carolina received tremendous amounts of rain. We had tropical downpours for a good good 8 to 12 hours, and the end result was a huge area in orange with more than 10 inches of rain, and there were many places that saw a foot to a foot and a half of rain across parts of North Carolina and South Carolina as well. This unfortunately caused tremendous, widespread record flooding across our area, and there are still areas that are recovering from this storm today, 3 years later, 2.5 to 3 years later. Then 2 seasons later, we had another one, Hurricane Florence. We just talked about this a few minutes ago. Category 4, as it was approaching the Carolinas, this looked like could be a catastrophe. It did weaken as it got closer. It was a Category 1 as it approached southeastern parts of North Carolina, but it really slowed down. You can see the wobbling path here. It took 2 days for the center of the storm to move from Wilmington to west of Myrtle Beach. At times, it was moving less than 5 miles per hour. You can walk faster than that. 2 days with a tropical system in the area produced unprecedented amounts of rain. A huge area, much bigger than Matthew, with more than 10 inches of rain. There's the area where we saw more than 30 inches of rain. And look at this huge area with 15 plus. Many places across South Carolina and North Carolina saw over 2 feet of rain, and the end result was catastrophic flooding. The Waccamaw River in Conway, this is a look at Conway at the flooding we saw. The previous record before these 2 storms was way back in 1928. The Okeechobee hurricane was the landmark for flooding in our part of the Carolinas, with a flood more than 7 feet, almost 8 feet above flood stage. That was broken during Hurricane Matthew in 2016. It was a little bit higher than the Okeechobee hurricane. And then Hurricane Florence, look at that. We beat that by 3.5 feet. So that was a flood 11 feet higher than flood stage. Other rivers in the area, same thing. The PD River, Gallivan's Ferry. The old record was the Okeechobee hurricane of 1928. Hurricane Matthew beat that by more than a foot. Hurricane Florence beat that as well, a little bit higher, causing just tremendous floods across the PD area. And then in Lumberton in North Carolina, this is a weird one. The old record was Hurricane Gaston, which really isn't a memorable hurricane, but it did produce a lot of rain. It broke Hurricane Floyd's records. That was 20 foot. 7 feet above flood stage. Hurricane Matthew beat that by 8 feet. Hurricane Florence, 29 feet. Both of these, they had to measure how high the flood water was because the flood gauge only went to 25 feet. So very, very catastrophic floods across parts of North Carolina. And I want to talk about the fatalities because Hurricane Matthew and Florence had unusually high numbers of fatalities. 25 in North Carolina, 4 in South Carolina. Florence was 15 and 4 as well. And most of these deaths were because of freshwater flooding. People that died in the rainfall and the flood that occurred because of the tremendous rainfall. And I've got an asterisk on here. I've got Hurricane Michael, last year's Hurricane Michael. It was a Category 5 hurricane that hit Florida. 7 people died in Florida, storm surge and the wind. In North Carolina, where Hurricane Florence made landfall, a Category 1 hurricane, more than double the deaths. Category 5, Category 1, all because of the freshwater flooding. So this is something we really need to take seriously. Even if it's a weak hurricane, if it produces a lot of rain, it can kill a lot of people. And this is the deaths in the United States because of hurricanes over 50 years. More than half of the people in hurricanes have died because of the storm surge. But also look at this, rainfall, freshwater flooding kills more than a quarter of the people that have died in hurricanes. And there is wind right in there at 8%. That is number 3 as well. So kind of just as you're preparing for hurricane season, trying to decide, do I evacuate? If it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, what is going to make me leave? Instead of looking at the wind speed and the category number, look at the weaknesses in your community. Are you right on the beach? You want to leave because of the storm surge. Do you have a lot of tall pine trees? Maybe it's the wind that's going to cause you problems. Or do you have a lot of rivers and creeks in your area that tend to flood? Are you going to be cut off from other communities and have to wait until those floodwaters come down? With Hurricane Florence, it was 10 to 14 days before that flood crest went from North Carolina to the Atlantic Ocean. So we were 2 weeks in flood coverage and roads cut off before things really started to return back to normal. So Wes, kind of a good thing to keep in mind. Category 1 storms, you can't say Category 1, I'm not going to worry about it. They can be just as deadly as Category 5 storms.
Indeed. And, you know, Frank, we're talking to you in Myrtle Beach tonight, and we know that's a huge vacation destination for people all over the Southeast in the summertime. So what do you see with out-of-towners who are at the beach as a hurricane is approaching, and how can families be better prepared for situations like that?
Well, for vacationers, it is very easy. You just follow what officials say. We have fantastic emergency managers in the Carolinas. When they evacuate, you leave. They do the lane reversals. They get people out of here very quickly. That's one of the reasons why we haven't had any deaths with these two storms, because of storm surge in South Carolina. But also you need to notice that it's not going to be a one-day storm. It's not just going to be a quick hit of storm surge and wind and then it's gone. We also have to deal with that flooding. And of the statistics of the people that have died because of the freshwater flooding with these two hurricanes in North Carolina and South Carolina, the majority of those were people in cars that A, either went around barricades and drove through closed roads, or B, drove through flooded roadways. So if a road is covered with water and flooded, you don't drive across it.
Frank, good stuff. He is joining us from Myrtle Beach, WBTW's Chief Meteorologist Frank Johnson. Frank, thank you. We'll be checking back in with you throughout the year. It is now about 8:20, and you're watching our live coverage of Eye on the Storm. This is our weekly special covering all things tropic, both present, past, and future. I'm Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I want to spend some time talking about the future because every year the National Hurricane Center has new stuff for us, new toys, new forecasts, new information that meteorologists and everyone else can use, and every year they make corrections to the forecast cone. It is the most widely used and viewed meteorological graphic throughout the whole year, you could argue, and that is the forecast cone. Where is a tropical storm or hurricane going to go? And what I have here behind me are the actual improvements. We're showing you how that cone has narrowed over the years. We start, obviously, with the widest. That line in purple, that mock cone, was what the cone looked like back in 2004. We continue on a few years later to 2009. You see the blue. Notice how it continues to shrink year after year. So while there's always a lot of criticism about the forecast for hurricanes not being very good, this is proof that the hurricane cone forecast has improved. A couple things to note about that. Remember, this forecast cone is just telling us where the eye of a hurricane or tropical storm is going to be. And only 2/3 of the time does it end up being within this cone. A third of the time, it's out. Of course, we also know that sometimes hurricanes can be 500 miles wide. Now, these cones are adjusted every year based on how accurate the forecast was in the past 5 years. So in 2019, we adjusted for the last 5 years. It did shrink up just a little. The biggest improvement that we saw was in the 48-hour forecast. It was reduced by about 8%. And you think to yourself, well, 8% is not going to save my life or get me out of storm surge or get me out of 20 inches of rain. But when you add that up over time, that does make a big deal. If you think back to where we were 10 to 20 years ago with hurricane forecasts, the information has gotten a lot better. So let's talk about the forecast. Again, that's the cone from the National Hurricane Center. Several universities and agencies across the country and really the world issue hurricane outlooks every year. Let's update you on the latest outlooks for this 2019 hurricane season. Keep it in mind, when we're talking about categories, we're talking about named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes. The averages, the 30-year average for those categories, 12, 6, and 3. That's something a lot of people commit to memory, 12, 6, 3, 12, 6, 3. So keep that in mind as we look at one of the forecasts from North Carolina State University here in Raleigh. 13 to 16 named storms. Remember, last year we had 15 named storms, 5 to 7 of those becoming hurricanes, 2 to 3 being major hurricanes, category 3, 4, or 5. Colorado State, which people often scratch their head and ask why are meteorologists in Colorado forecasting hurricanes. They've yet to have a direct hit. But some of the best meteorologists in the world work on their hurricane outlook, and they've been doing it longer than anyone else. And I'll tell you what, they're pretty good at it. 13 named storms, again, the average 12, 5 of those becoming hurricanes, 2 of those becoming major hurricanes. And I'll finish with our government. NOAA, the National Hurricane Center, the Climactic Data Center, a large group of agencies work together to come up with the forecast officially from our government. 9 to 15 named storms, 4 to 8 of them becoming hurricanes, 2 to 4 becoming major hurricanes. So that's a lot of numbers up there. What does this really mean? Well, if you kind of just look at the big snapshot, the overall message is it looks like tropical activity will be average this year. Remember, 12, 6, 3. Of course, you get one hurricane and it's a bad year for you. You don't get any and it's considered a good year. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But this year is an unfortunate anniversary in the tropical world. Hurricane Hugo made landfall as a Category 4 hurricane in September of 1989. That's been 30 years now. South Carolina suffered the worst impact. Losses reached at least $5.9 billion. $5.9 billion. There were 27 fatalities and more than 100,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. That's just in South Carolina. That storm affected a huge region. Chief Meteorologist Rob Fowler from WCBD in Charleston, South Carolina, was there in September of 1989. Rob, good to see you tonight. Can you take us back to Hurricane Hugo? And I guess before you do that, can you also take us back to earlier today and tell us what happened with your station and a lightning strike? A busy day for you.
Yeah, it really has been, Wes. Welcome to a soggy Charleston, South Carolina, where we set a record in downtown, almost 4 inches of rain. That's a daily record. And not only did it beat the record, it actually doubled the record. The old record was about 1.7 inches. So if you've been to Charleston, you see our open-air market. It's a kind of an icon here in the middle of our city. They had waist-deep water there today, up to the waist and the knees in some cases. So it's been a soggy day. We were hit by a lightning strike here at our TV station. We have a big 700-foot tower that took a direct hit, and that kind of jolted the building and knocked out some of our systems. So we're happy to be with you tonight. Great information the other meteorologists are sharing, but while some folks are looking back just a couple of years, we're going to go back 30 years. All year long here at WCBD, we're looking back at the anniversary of Hurricane Hugo. As you mentioned, actually September 21st and 22nd was the actual official landfall. But the reason we're doing this is because we have so many people who have moved here post-Hugo. When I got here in Mount Pleasant, we were about 15,000 people. We're just on the other side of the river from downtown Charleston. Now we're about 90,000 people. So a lot of people did not go through Hugo. And you can see this is the iconic satellite image going back to that night, the landfall right in Charleston Harbor. The storm itself was roughly about 600 miles in diameter. The average hurricane is about half that size. So while half of the storm was over land doing damage, the other half was maintaining its strength and energy over the water. So certainly something to watch. We were tracking the storm as we do. We track about 100 disturbances each and every year. But I'll be honest with you, on June 12th of 1989, I was not sitting here saying, boy, this is going to be our year. That's why we tell people to prepare as if it is going to be your year every single year, because we had no idea that later that summer we would see Hurricane Hugo actually form coming off the continent of Africa as a cluster of thunderstorms September 9th of 1989. It became a hurricane, a Category 1 hurricane with 75-mile-per-hour winds 5 days later, September 14th. By the 15th, though, it had strengthened in the open water to a Category 5. The winds were 160. And I'll be honest with you, when we really started taking it seriously, not that we hadn't before, is right there when it was about to hit Puerto Rico. As it moved off Puerto Rico, that was a Monday, and we knew that eventually we think there would be some recurvature, and that was in the official forecast. But after that, when the winds were about 150 miles an hour, you will see it never deviated off a northwest track right into Charleston Harbor. So it never made that turn. Even as late as 9 o'clock that night, we were on the air telling people it's not going to turn. There were some models turning it more towards Myrtle Beach, but again, it came right up the harbor, and moved right into the state of South Carolina. Through Charlotte, North Carolina, they had winds of about 100 miles an hour. But the landfall itself, with winds of 135 miles an hour, 935 millibars, basically about 27.58 inches of mercury. And again, it was a fast mover, thank goodness. And what we really try to tell our people here is the fact that the Charleston area did not get the worst of Hurricane Hugo. Yes, it was a Category 4, but that was an area just up the coast, McClellanville, Cape Romaine, Bulls Bay. We have a big forest, the Francis Marion National Forest. That was the area hardest hit from Hugo. That is the area that got the strongest winds. Most of Charleston only saw Category 2 conditions, so we try to tell our viewers, unfortunately, even though you thought you went through the worst of Hurricane Hugo, most likely you did not. So somewhere, sometime, it's going to be worse. Now, as far as rainfall, because it was moving 20 to 25 miles an hour, that really saved us in terms of the amount of rain. The maximum recorded at Edisto Island, that's just south of Charleston, at about 10.5 inches or so. Keep in mind now, when Floyd came through in 1999, it dumped feet of rain across eastern North Carolina because it was moving slower. Had Hugo been moving slower, we would have seen a lot more damage in terms of wind damage as well as flooding. So landfall at 12 a.m. Charleston Harbor on the morning of the 22nd. 135-mile-per-hour winds, 49 storm-related fatalities, and you can see 26 occurred right here in the United States. And many of the fatalities, unfortunately, happened after the storm. People maybe chainsaw accidents up on the roof, falling off, trying to kind of cover up the damage. These are some iconic photos that we show. This is the Ben Sawyer Bridge. At that time, it was the only way to get from the mainland to the Barrier Islands. We have another way to get there now called the Isle of Palms Connector, but back in 1989, that was the only way, and you can see what happened. It was kind of taken apart and turned like a whirlybird, they said, and dislodged, not allowing people to go from the Barrier Islands back onto the mainland. This is one of our main streets, Lockwood Boulevard, and you can see Hugo the Power taking giant sailboats, putting it right in the middle of the water. This is over on Folly Beach, the Atlantic House restaurant. It's iconic. Many of the old-timers always talk about going and taking their dates to the Atlantic House. Well, after Hurricane Hugo came, that was the Atlantic House before Hugo, and that was the Atlantic House, what was left after Hurricane Hugo. So it is no more and has never been rebuilt. So Wes, obviously we've been impacted by the floods of 2015, Matthew in 2016, Irma in 2017, and of course last year as well with Florence. But I think a lot of us always remember Hurricane Hugo, still the benchmark for us. When I got here in 1987, the storms that people asked me about were Hazel in 54 and Gracie in 1959. So it's been 30 years between Gracie and Hurricane Hugo. But this is something we'll always remember because we know what a major hurricane can do to your coastline.
Yeah, you know, Rob, 30 years, that's a long time on the calendar, but a long time with technology and just our society. Remind us how different life was back then for people living on the coast and for you with weather technology.
Well, when you talked about the cone, I had to chuckle a little bit because this was probably one of the toughest things I ever had to do because back then we didn't have the cone of uncertainty. You had to physically plot dots based on latitude and longitude that you received from the National Hurricane Center. So as I was plotting those dots and realizing the dots were getting closer to the Charleston coast, basically it was very scary when I had to put that final dot, and people weren't thinking it could go here, it could go there. They were focusing on that dot or that line. So that was pretty tough back then to do that. Obviously, the technology in terms of the radar, we had the old WSR-57 radar that was 1957. It had tubes that had maybe 4 or 5 colors on it. You couldn't really differentiate between all the different levels of rainfall. That was kind of intimidating at that time, and now we have great technology. The Doppler system that can look inside the storms and detect tornadoes as well. So we've come a long way. I also remember, Wes, that back in those days, our weather systems, we had to make a long-distance call to get satellite images. Now they're satellite delivered or delivered via the internet. So back then, when you had to make a long-distance call to get one picture every 3 hours because the bill was a little bit higher, that was pretty interesting as well. But we made it through, and we learned a lot from Hurricane Hugo.
And Rob, we'll finish up with this. I'll just let all our people watching tonight what a long-distance phone call is. It's back in the day where you actually had to dial a 1 from your rotary phone and then 3 numbers before the 7. Rob Fowler in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the best in the business. If you're ever down in Charleston vacationing, check out Rob. If you're in Myrtle Beach, Frank is there. Jerry in the eastern part of North Carolina. And I'm here in Raleigh. That is going to do it for us tonight on this edition of Eye on the Storm. Remember, we will be right here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock talking hurricanes until the season ends in November. Each week we'll have different stories and different perspectives on the 2019 hurricane season. Thanks so much for spending some of your night with us live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein. Good night.